Welcome back, everyone. Second week of Proverbs. An interesting study. I mentioned last week some of my trepidation when I teach this study, some of the difficulties that I have found personally in teaching it. And I want to remind you of something that our author also points out very well in the study, and it's in your personal study guide. And if you haven't gotten one, you can swing by the church and make yourself help yourself to one. We have plenty here. And the reality of this study, and it's something to keep in mind, especially as we jump into chapter 3 today, is this that the author points out to us. And he says, proverbial sayings are a little different than the direct promises of God. And let me just expand on that for just a minute before we jump into chapter 3 here. And it is chapter 3 today, verses 1 through 12. In that statement is a lot of information. Proverbial sayings are different than the direct promises of God. And what I mean by that is a lot of times people love the book of Proverbs. I remember being told years ago by someone that if I wanted to be successful in life, that I should read a chapter of Proverbs a day for the rest of my life. Now, it's a good challenge. It's not something I would recommend you not do. But this person's teaching was more about success in life and me achieving something. And if you'll remember last week, I pointed out to you that the antithetical book to the book of Proverbs, or the book that essentially says, maybe that all doesn't happen, is the book of Job. And if you remember last week that we looked at wisdom as having three different realities to it. And wisdom is wisdom in relation to our ability. Maybe you have a skill, whether it's woodworking or sewing or artistic ability or something like that. So you have the wisdom that's related to your ability. You also have the wisdom that's related to practical living, which is the category in which Proverbs falls. And then you have wisdom as into the actual meaning of life. What is the wholesale meaning of life? Why do we live? Why do we breathe? Why do our lives happen? Why do we live only certain periods of time? Why do some people live different periods of time? Why do some people experience sufferings? Why do some people not experience sufferings? And the reality of that wisdom and the truth of that wisdom is to help you get the direction for it in the book of Job. So, yes, success may come from reading Proverbs daily, but if you want to understand life, go read Job. And I'm so thankful that our author took the time to point that out to us and remind us of this truth. So today we're in Proverbs chapter 3. We're in 12 verses. And today I'm going to give you this little word up here on the board. And if you have your book, you've seen it in your book. And it's, let me make sure I'm spelling it right, quatrain. Quatrain. And what these are, and there's 6 of them in this passage that we're reading today. There's 12 verses, and there's 6 quatrains. And what they exist is one directive and one result. Okay? So if you're reading this passage, the directives are the odd verses, and these are the even verses. So verse 1, verse 2, verse 1, verse 3, verse 4, verse 5, verse 6, whatever. So, and for that reason, this is a great passage to read. It's a great passage to study. It's a great passage to teach. However, remember what our author is reminding us of when we look at this passage is these are not the direct promises of God. These are proverbial sayings. In other words, these are the normal things that we see happen in a life when normal circumstances exist. Okay? And so the writer of the book of Proverbs would tell us that because the same writer who wrote the majority of the book of Proverbs also wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. And the book of Ecclesiastes essentially says, I don't know why I lived. I don't even know why there's purpose. I can't even understand why I do things. I can't understand why I study. And so you have to take these books and combine them together, because a lot of times I have found as a believer, my tendency is to go to the book of Proverbs and say, all right, there's this trust in the Lord with all your heart. I just did a really not smart thing, or maybe I did something I regret, or maybe I've acted in a way that I'm embarrassed by, but I'm just going to trust God and I'm going to hold on and it's all going to be all right. But life doesn't work that way. And life doesn't allow us that ability to pretend that other things did not happen. And so we're going to look at these 12 verses. We're going to break them into 3 different sections, 1 and 4, 5 through 8, and verses 9 through 12. We're going to spend a lot more time on the first 2 passages, 1 through 4, and 5 through 8. And so if you have your book, or if not, if you got your Bible with you, open up to Proverbs chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. And I'm reading today out of the Christian Standard Bible, which is the Bible that's produced by Bowman, who publishes for Lifeway. So here we go. My son, don't forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commands, for they will bring you many days, a full life, and well-being. Never let loyalty and faithfulness leave you. Tie them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. Then you will find favor and high regard with God and people. Man, that's a great 4 verses. I mean, if you have a kid, a grandkid, if you are a kid or a grandkid, man, you need to read those verses and take them to heart and begin to look for ways to bring this into your life. And so, the first thing I want us to get behind us, though, is when Solomon starts this, he says, don't forget my teaching. Well, what was his teaching? Well, you got to go back to chapters 1 and 2, the previous chapters, where he had already begun to outline some things. And so when you do that, and in our books has a great summary of chapter 2. And so I encourage you to read that on page 20 and kind of come to grips with that. And he talks about how wisdom is available and how we can seek God and how God is in the daily circumstances of our life. And that's kind of the whole idea we began to wrestle with last week and try to understand is, have you seen God? Or what would you say if someone asked you, had you seen God at work today? Or have you seen God's presence today? And so Solomon challenges us to say that wisdom is right there. It's right around the corner. It's literally calling our names in the streets of our cities. What an incredible statement, and what a verse to read at this time in our lives and in this time in the life of our nation. And so we're going to look at how this applies to us. So he says, don't forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commands. Now, what he says is 2 different things there. Don't forget, that's mere intelligence, but let your heart keep my commands. That's your emotions. Okay, so Solomon is telling his son, or his young man who is under his authority here, possibly the one who he envisions to lead the kingdom when he is no longer king. He says this, you need your intellect and you need your emotion. Let your heart keep my commands. And if you remember, go back and how Jesus summed up the commands of God. Jesus said you can sum up the commands of God like this. Number 1, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind. And number 2, love your neighbor as yourself. We're going to look a little bit more at what that means a little bit later. But one of the things we see here is this necessity to emotionally involve ourselves in our lives. You said, wait a minute, what do you mean emotionally involve myself in my life? My life is an emotion. I live emotionally. Well, one of the reasons that happens in our lives, and I'll give you an example here, and if you're not on social media, then this doesn't apply to you particularly, but you may think of a way this applies to you. Social media has become an arena of our lives, a reality of our lives, where a lot of times what we're doing is simply copying and sharing what someone else has said. In fact, many times we don't even read the entire post. We don't realize that, hey, that Amber Alert was from 2 years ago, or that story of that robbery or that horrible situation happened 4 or 5 years ago. But we like what it means to us, and so we just throw ourselves out there with it. Well, what Solomon is saying here, I think Solomon would look at that sort of behavior, and he would say to me, hey, Daniel, if you're just copying and pasting everybody else's stuff, you're not using your intelligence and you're not using your emotion. You're not owning the reality of that moment. And so there is so much in this passage, as I've read these 12 verses over and over this past week and thought through them. There is so much here that he is pointing to us and saying to us, you had better live in each and every moment. Okay? He says, for they will bring you, and that was the directive. Okay? Don't forget the teaching, but let your heart keep my commands. And here's the result. For they will bring you many days of full life and well-being. Now we read that, and the first thing we think is, I'm going to live a long life. Could be true. Remember, proverbial sayings are not the same as the direct promises of God. What he is saying here is this. They will bring you many days a full life. A full life is one in which you are completely alive the entire time. A full life is the one in which you absolutely own and realize your experiences. And you don't pawn them off on someone else. I don't pawn them off on someone else. That requires work, folks, because here's what he says. He says, now the next one, directive. Never let loyalty and faithfulness leave you. Now, I could just jump right over those two words and us get our typical English translation from that. But the King James Version actually has the more truthful interpretation of that word, and the word there is mercy. Never let mercy and truth leave you. Now you think about your life for just a minute. Where has mercy left you? Where have we left mercy? And see, here's the reality of it. It's our responsibility to bring mercy along because it's something that we give to other people. And so we literally have to wake up in the morning and pack our suitcase and pack our bag and throw mercy on our back like a kid going to school with a backpack and walk out of the house with it and hold on to it. Because all throughout the day, the tendency is going to be to set that backpack down, to leave mercy behind you, to leave it because the person in front of you has annoyed you. The person on the social media screen has annoyed you. The newscaster on the television has annoyed you. The behavior of your neighbor, whether it's your neighbor who lives next to you, or whether it's your neighbor who posted a sign down the road, or whether it's your neighbor who's living 3,000 miles away, who is maybe on your television screen, or whatever it is. Your neighbor has done something, and you and I want to leave mercy behind, and we want to go and destroy that person. Get out of my way. You're tearing up my life. I'm going to get you. And Solomon says this, never let mercy and truth leave you. And then he gives us a scripture, tie them around your neck and write them on the tablet of your heart. So he gives two directives there. Tie them around your neck. In other words, make something that's going to stick with you, and then write them on the tablet of your heart. Once again, we're talking about intellect and emotion. And he's telling us this in our lives. We just got to dig in and get totally involved. And this is work. It's work to show mercy and truth daily. And then he says this, and you will find favor and high regard with God and people. The result. Here's the thing. Most of us in our life can find a few people that greatly admire us. Maybe they admire us for what we do for them. Maybe they admire us simply because of the position we have in their life. But it is extremely difficult to have a wide variety of people admire us. And this is the challenge that Solomon's laying before us here, to live a life that is so full that people have high regard for us. It is work, it's effort, and it's constant reminding to show mercy and God's favor to others. And so I want to go back to, as I turn the page here and we get ready to go into verses 5 through 8. I want us to look at something here. It says a direct promise, and this is on page 22 in your books, is something you can take to the bank, a sure thing based on the character of God. A proverbial saying is a truism that is most often true, but may not operate on the same level as a direct promise. Okay? And so, and then the author gives us a great example. Romans chapter 10, verse 13 says, whoever calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. All right? And Proverbs 22, chapter 6 says, start a youth out on his way, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Okay, one we say, oh, that's an absolute truth. The other one we say, well, that's a true saying that normally applies. Okay, so we look to a commitment of mercy and truth. So then we jump into some of our favorite verses in Scripture that we've probably all quoted or we've heard quoted. Verses 5 through 8, and it says this, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own understanding. In all your ways, know Him, and He will make your path straight. Don't be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. This will be healing for your body and strengthening for your bones. Okay, as we jump into this passage and we remind ourselves of this, he says this, and the first thing is a directive in the odd verse. Okay, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not rely on your own understanding. So in other words, trust in God and don't rely on your understanding, your own understanding. And then secondly, the result is this, in all your ways know Him and He will make your paths straight. That's a tremendous promise. That's a tremendous reality. That's a tremendous truth that we can hold on to as we seek to honor God. And I want to remind us of something here. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not rely on your own understanding. Do you remember the story of Joshua getting ready to lead the Israelites in their first battle? For 40 years he's followed Moses in the wilderness. For 40 years he literally has played second fiddle to the most powerful man that the Israelites had ever known. He leaves. He leaves Joshua in charge. The people recognize Joshua as being in charge, and Joshua now has the privilege of leading them in their first battle. And he straps on his sword. I can't imagine the excitement. And he's walking down this path. And I'm going to suppose it's by a river because that's just how I suppose things. And he's walking down this path and he meets this angel. And Joshua is so pumped up that he's about to go to his first battle that he doesn't look and say, that's an angel, maybe I should run. He doesn't look and say, that's an angel, what in the world is that thing doing here, or that being doing here? He looks at the angel, and basically the idea is he presents the sword to the angel and he says, whose side are you on? Mine or theirs? In other words, he challenges them. Man, I'm younger than Joshua was then. But I can't tell you the number of times, even in this week, even in these days, that I don't want to just grab up a sword and go stand in the middle of a street and say, whose side are you on? Mine or theirs? The angel looks at Joshua, and if you remember the story, the angel is an appearance of Jesus Christ. It is God himself. And the angel looks at Joshua and says, let me tell you something, buddy. The question is, whose side are you on? Now let me just pause this for just a minute there. Too many times I rely on my own understanding, the way I was raised, the things I was taught, where I went to school, the things I learned, the cultures I adapted to, the things I picked up, the style of food that I like. And I say, those are the right ways. And I believe that at times in my life that literally God himself has stopped in the middle of my path and challenged me and said, whose side are you on? Because it sure is easy to do things that we think are right and be against God. Okay, so this is Solomon's challenge. Do not rely on your own understanding. That's a directive. And he will make your paths straight. In other words, he will allow us to see what is happening before us. Then he follows us. And by the way, let me help you out with this. Let me give you a figurative illustration that Jesus gave us. Do you remember the story of the Good Samaritan, the man who was beaten, robbed, and left for dead on the side of the road? It was no accident that it was religious men that Jesus had walk past him and leave him. He was dirty. He was violated. He should be left alone. Their own understanding led them to walk past a man in need. And Jesus said, that is not right. He is a precious child, and that is shown by the outsider, the one who would have been rejected by all of them, coming, bandaging his wounds, and taking care of him. It's a story that ought to challenge us. I think about this when he says, rely on your own understanding, and I think about these words, our demands, for things to be done our way. You know, a lot of times we cover up our demands by saying things like, well, it's for my kids, it's for my grandkids, it's for the betterment of society, it's for this, it's for that, it's for whatever. And we cover up our demands by putting them on somebody else. For example, maybe you really want, and I'm guilty of this, okay? Just hang with me for just a minute. If you're married and you've ever gone out to eat with your spouse, you have one of these conversations. Where would you like to eat tonight? It doesn't matter. Where would you like to eat? It doesn't matter. Where would you like? It doesn't matter. I don't care. I don't know. I don't know. And yet, more than likely, one person's got a little bit of a desire. So, if you have kids or grandkids, you whisper to the kid, hey, tell your mama, let's go to Taco Bell. And after about two of those back and forths of, I don't know what I want, you don't know what you want, you turn around to the kid in the back and you say, Lila, what would you like to eat? And she's supposed to say, Taco Bell. And guess what? I get what I want. You see, a lot of times we do that. We cover up our desires by putting them off on someone else. And Solomon challenges us not to lean on our own understanding. And here's how we do it. He says this, don't be wise in your own eyes, fear the Lord and turn away from evil. And it's not just our eyes that we don't need to be wise in. We don't need to be wise in the people who look like us, act like us, talk like us, and think like us. You say, wait a minute, that was really fast. I don't understand what you're saying. Well, here's what I'm saying. We have a tendency to only listen to the people that we already approve of. I have that tendency to only listen to the people that I know are going to solidify my position. I have a tendency to only listen to the people who I know are going to teach a certain thing. For example, we talked a little bit last week. We kind of glossed over it. in our passage on the book of 1 Peter, which I'm teaching in the Bible Studies for Life on my own YouTube channel. It's kind of geared towards my students, but I've been teaching that. And we got into the predestination election, okay? You know what I did with that one right there? I just did a big flyover. And if you're familiar with that argument, you're going to look at me and say, either you were foolish or that's the right thing to do. But the reality of it is, and I've been in this debate for 42 years. My dad is a pastor. I've been in this debate for 42 years. I'm 42 years old, and I've been in the predestination debate for 42 years. Actually, 42 years and 9 months. Every one of us can pull noted biblical theologians out of our book bag and say, this is my guy, and this is what he teaches. And we choose the people that we approve of to listen to. That's just typical reality. So he says this, don't be wise in your own eyes, fear the Lord, and turn away from evil. And the idea there is that there's such a reverence for God's presence that we recognize our own selfish behavior. And that's a huge challenge. Think about that. When he says fear the Lord, remember that's awe, that's reverence, that's noticing God's presence. And then he says this and turn away from evil. And what is evil? It's not going necessarily and robbing a bank, although that certainly is evil. It is simply saying that I want what I want, and what I want comes before everybody else. So he's challenged. There's a triple challenge there. Don't be wise in your own eyes, fear the Lord, and turn away from evil. So in other words, quit taking your own advice first. Look and be in reverence of who God is, and turn away from what you know is selfish behavior. The things that you are choosing to do that work for you. Then look what he says, and this is beautiful, and I just challenge you to go read it. Read it 20 times this week. This will be healing for your body and strengthening for your bones. Oh my goodness. Do you know how much anger there is in the world today? Now I said that, and some of you immediately started thinking of some of the circumstances of our world, and I did too. But the circumstances of our world are not just what we see on a television screen. They're the people like you and I, who maybe we're not on the screens, but man, it's consuming us. At this idea that maybe somebody else has a different opinion, or maybe somebody else is doing something wrong, or maybe this person over here did this, but it's not as bad as this one over here, and maybe we see this circumstance here, but they didn't see this circumstance here, and this rage is just developing within us, and it's consuming us. And it's because we become wise in our own eyes. I've started taking my own advice more than anyone else. Let's continue on, verses 9 through 12. I set a time limit for myself. I'm getting it done. Verses 9 through 12. Honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first produce of your entire harvest. The directive is put God first. Honor God with what you have, with your production and with what you have. Then here's the result. Then your barns will be completely filled and your vats will overflow with new wine. Now we see that sometimes and we want to say, my goodness, all I got to do is give God X number of dollars and then I'm going to have X number of dollars in return. That's a great investment. I mean, that makes sense, right? If you make $100 and you give God 10 and God blesses you back 110%, that's better than the stock market. Remember, this is a proverbial saying. This is not a direct promise from God. This is simply saying that when you live a life that puts God first, then you're going to have plenty. I think one of the reasons you have plenty when you put God first is you begin to realize how little you actually need. When you begin to put God first, and by the way, you can try this out in a way that isn't even spiritually related. If you decide to save money first, before you spend a dime, guess what you'll find yourself with? Extra money. If you have the basic amount of money to pay your bills, in other words, if you were to sit down with a financial planner or a teacher today, and you had an X number of dollars to pay your bills, so let's just suppose your bills were, let's just show a nice little round figure out there, or a small one. We'll say your bills are $2,000 a month, and your advisor looks at you and says, you've got $2,200. You have no problem paying all your bills and living your life, and everything's going to be okay if you just follow this thing. If you set yourself up to save money first, you will find at the end of the month you will have spent less than if you spent money first and tried to save later. That's a time-honored reality and proof that you can go research and you can read and you can challenge yourself with. All right, so what does verses 11 through 12 say? Because now he circles it around. He's given all these challenges for how you should live your life and what the result is. And now he challenges around. He just says, by the way, it ain't going to be easy. Now, I like to take Scripture and I like to put it in my English because that's how I understand it. And you say, well, what do you mean when he says it won't be easy? Well, here's what he says. Do not despise the Lord's instruction, my son, and do not loathe his discipline. Remember, the first verse of the quatrain is the directive. So the directive is this: you got problems ahead. There's bumpy roads coming. Do not despise the Lord's instruction, my son, and do not loathe his discipline. And then he says, for the Lord disciplines the one he loves, just as the Father disciplines the Son, in whom he delights. And so what he's saying, the directive is, don't despise discipline. Discipline is a result of God's love. Now, you and I have a tendency to think of discipline as what Mom and Dad used to do with a stick off the plum tree or the peach tree or whatever other tree they could get a hold of. And that certainly may be a form of discipline. But the real idea here is this restricting of the road. And so if you imagine a bowling lane, right? And you imagine having the bumpers up on each side. The word discipline is simply putting a guide in front of us. And so right now in your life, I can promise you this: if you're still alive and you are still breathing and functioning and living your life, you are bumping against, and I am bumping against, the discipline of God. Once again, let me be careful there. I'm not saying God's chasing you with a stick. I'm simply saying there are realities that we are bumping up against in our life that are proof that God is allowing us to change our behaviors. God is allowing us to change the way we see things. God is allowing us to change the way we view others. God is challenging us in our love for our neighbor. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 1 through 12. It's a quatrain, 6 of them. There's a directive. Do this. There's a result. This is the usual result. Take it, read it, and have a faith that God's presence will be real in your life daily. Thank you, and God bless you.